Thank you for clicking on this video. In this episode, we're going to be discussing atmospheric perspective and doing a few experiments on how to layer bright colors on dark backgrounds as we draw one of the most iconic Disney princesses of all time. Welcome to Art Party Now. All right, so as you can see, I've got Belle all sketched out in blue pencils on brilliant blue poster board. I've got my supersized Sharpie for the outlines, fine point Sharpie for the details. I've got a piece of blotter paper underneath, but everything's taped down. So if you wanna draw along with me today, right now would be the perfect time to get out your materials and get set up. Or if you just wanna grab a cup of hot chocolate, curl up on the couch, and enjoy the party that way, that's totally cool too. So let's rock and roll. So we're gonna start by drawing the outline of Belle's face, which you wanna keep really light, kind of like an M-shaped forehead with a pointy little chin. Then we're gonna do thin neck, because of course she's a princess, and then do the outline of her hair with a little bun on top, and then add a few folds in the hair just to give it some depth. Next, we're gonna do Belle's shoulders and add just kind of like an outline to show where the rose she's holding is gonna be without doing any details to it. And then we're gonna come back and do the details in her face, the eyes with big eyelashes, very light eyebrows. Don't wanna give a Disney princess heavy eyebrows, but big open eyes. And then with the nose, we barely wanna draw it. So we just kind of do like a little line for underneath it. And then the smile is kind of tough, but just watch how I do it. Then once we have the face, we can connect a nice wavy piece of hair to her shoulder, draw the top of her ball gown. And then we're just gonna do a few jagged kind of shapes to define where the leaves are on the stem of the rose. All right, so once we have that part, we're gonna use the fine point Sharpie to do some of the details on her arms and hands. The good thing about this drawing though is that because Belle's wearing gloves, you don't really want to draw all the individual figures. You just want to kind of draw an outline shape of the hand and not really try to get too detailed about it. So same thing with the other arm. Just kind of draw like the outline shape of the hand. A couple little ends of the fingers, it's just shapes. All right, so once we have her gloves, then we're gonna wanna draw her waist, which comes to a little point at the bottom. And then we can kind of do some scraggly lines for the bottom part of the thorns on the rose. Again, we're not getting too detailed, we're just kind of like giving the impression. And then we got a stripe that comes right down the center of her dress. And that's kind of defining the midpoint. So once we have the top half, then we just gotta kind of define where these shapes on the bottom half of the ball gown. This is the most fun part here. So We're gonna draw a line coming straight down with a little circle on the end to get to like the halfway point on the ball gown. And same thing on the other side. And then once we have all of our little circles to define the halfway point, then we start connecting them with little U shapes. This will end up being the little drapery in the midsection of her giant ball gown. And all of this could change when we go back and color it in, but for now we're just trying to outline the shapes. So we really just want to like get the overall shape of the ball gown here. And then we continue those lines down to the bottom where the sections get thicker towards the bottom. So it kind of gives it the illusion of depth. Make sure to put one little shoe kind of peeking out in the middle there. Then we just kind of want to add a couple little lines to define where we want to draw the folds when we color it back in. And that's it. All right, so there's our finished outline of Belle from Beauty and the Beast. So I'm gonna go back and darken in my lines. So make sure you stick around because the party's just getting started. In this phase of our drawing, I'm actually doing a lot more than just darkening lines. What I'm doing is darkening specific lines to increase the illusion of shadows and weight, as I've explained in previous episodes, but I'm also darkening specific lines to create the illusion of atmosphere, which is a process I'll explain in greater detail in just a moment. Okay, so before we move on to coloring in Belle, there's something really cool that I want to show you that completely changed the way I've thought about drawing ever since I learned it. So there's two types of perspective. Normal perspective is that drawing that we all did in art class in 6th grade that looks like this, where there's a vanishing point. The road gets smaller as it goes towards the vanishing point. Everything gets smaller as it moves away in space. So normal perspective is things get smaller as they move away in space. Atmospheric perspective is that as things move away in space, they get grayer. So the things with the highest contrast, the darkest black and white, would look closer to us, and then as things move farther away, they get grayer and grayer because of the amount of atmosphere that's between us and the object. So I've managed to translate this into almost every artwork I've done since I learned it, probably back when I was 13. So if you didn't know about this simple little thing is a total game changer. Okay, so how does atmospheric perspective apply to our drawing of Belle? Well, if you look at this diagram right here, I think you'll be able to notice that when I'm drawing this, even though there's not a lot of depth in cartoons, you can still create an atmosphere by just imagining if it was actually a three-dimensional object. So if this were a real three-dimensional ball gown, there are parts of it that would be closer to us and parts that would be farther away. So when I'm going back and darkening in all my lines, I'm trying to add bolder lines in the areas where the dress would be coming closer to us and not adding extra thickness to the areas that are farther away. Same thing with the hands and the face. Like I made the hands a little bit thicker and darker lines than the face because they're a little bit closer to us in space. So even though cartoons are thought of as flat and two-dimensional, I just want to show you that you can still give them an atmosphere by thinking about and playing with the contrast. All right, so there's our finished Sharpie drawing of Belle from Beauty and the Beast. So if you've been drawing along with me, right now would be the perfect time to smooth out your lines, make everything just how you want it, because coming up next is the most fun part of the party, where we bring Belle to life with color. In our initial phase of color, I'm using an acrylic paint pen to give a really sharp edge to the outlines on Belle's dress. All right, so now that I've got the edges of Belle's dress outlined with color, I'm gonna start using some colored pencils to start filling in her face. Okay, so if you take a really close look at the way I'm building up Belle's skin tones here, you'll notice that I'm using the same contour coloring marks that I was using in our last episode. But you also notice that the pencils really aren't showing up all that strong on this blue background. So why am I doing it? Well, the reason I'm using the colored pencils first is for two reasons. One is so that I can map out all the areas of light and shadow before I go to the oil pastels, because the pastels are so thick that I can always change it on the fly if I want to. And two is because the pencils are good at getting into the finer detail areas, so that hopefully when I add the oil pastels, I won't need to use as much of them to really bring Belle to life. So now that I have my highlights and shadows mapped out for the face and the hair, it's time to start working on the ball gown. In this phase of color, I'm using an orange paint pen for the shadows on the dress, as well as testing out our oil pastels to see if they'll show up bright enough on this royal blue background. All right, so I just tested out my oil pastels on the dress, and even those aren't showing up very bright. So I'm gonna switch back to my Sharpie creative markers. I might use the pastels at the end to blend some of the colors together, but for now, it looks like these are the only ones that really stick to this paper, so let's keep it going. Now that we've got the proper materials figured out, we're going to use our initial outlines as a guide to start mapping out all the folds in Belle's bright yellow ball gown. And after we have our primary yellow areas filled in, we'll use our white paint pen to start mapping out our highlights. Okay, so now that I've got the ball gown mostly mapped out, this next part's gonna get a little interesting. I'm gonna fill in Belle's hair, but since I don't want it to just be like a flat brown, I'm gonna use brighter colors, a red for the shadows and an orange for the highlights, and then color over top of that with brown so that hopefully the brighter colors are showing through from underneath. So let's hope this works. Okay, so that actually worked out pretty well with the hair there. So I'm gonna use the same technique to do the undertones for Belle's skin. So I'm gonna use a pink for the shadows, and a white for the highlights, and then color back over those afterwards. Now I'm gonna let those layers settle for a little bit while I continue working on the ball gown. Now we're gonna add a second layer of white to all the highlight areas on Belle's dress and blend the white into the yellow. All right, so now that I've let this initial layer settle overnight, I should be able to put a final layer on top of these colors without any of this initial layer smudging or moving out of the way. So hopefully this is a good grounded, dry layer. And now I can add all my finishing touch colors. Let's keep it going. Now we're gonna add one more layer of orange to all the shadow areas on Belle's dress. And one more layer of yellow to make sure all of our colors show up vivid and bright against this blue background. All right, so it took a bunch of layers, but I feel like I've got the ball gown looking like how I want it to look as far as like brightness. So now I'm gonna go back and add a second layer to Belle's skin and hair and put down a first layer for the flower. So I feel like we're getting close to the end result. So don't go anywhere because I feel like these next few moves are where it's all gonna come together. So I'm actually really happy with how Belle is turning out at this stage. Really love the way that the hair worked out, the skin tones with the oil pastel on top of the creative markers really worked. So hope you guys had fun in this episode of How to Draw Belle from Beauty and the Beast. I'm probably gonna do a couple little more finishing touches before I call this complete. So make sure you stick around for the final reveal so you can see all this close up. Make sure to check out all your other favorite characters in our cartoon collection, and we'll see you at the next art party. This episode of Art Party Now is brought to you by Feng Shui Energy Fine Art Prints. Click the link in the description to order yours today. Thank you so much for joining us at the art party today. If you had fun or learned anything, please consider liking, sharing, and subscribing to our channel. Drop us a comment if you have any requests for future episodes, and click this link to keep the party going.